The scandal didn't explode quietly, it detonated like a controlled demolition of credibility. The kind where every carefully placed charge reveals something uglier underneath, and by the time the dust begins to settle, there's nothing left to hide, because what was once dressed as a noble humanitarian tour in Australia has now been ripped open as something far colder, far sharper, and far more calculated than anyone expected, and at the center of it all stands a furious Prince William, no longer watching from a distance, no longer tolerating the slow erosion of the monarchy's integrity, but actively stepping in, exposing what he reportedly sees as a calculated commercial operation masquerading as compassion, a system where pain is packaged, priced, and sold back to the very public it claims to serve. And the moment that realization hit, March 17 in Sydney, everything changed, because it wasn't Harry's words that triggered outrage, it was the price of hearing them, a staggering $5,000 just to enter the room, climbing to $15,000 for proximity, for a handshake, for access, for the illusion of intimacy with royalty, and suddenly the narrative collapsed under its own weight. Because how do you preach accessibility while building a wall only the wealthy can climb? How do you speak of mental health while monetizing it like a luxury experience? And that contradiction, that glaring, uncomfortable contradiction, is exactly what William is said to have seized on, reportedly calling it not advocacy, but a business model in disguise, a transformation of royal goodwill into a revenue stream. And from that moment, the situation spiraled, because behind the ticket prices lay something even more explosive, something far more dangerous than optics: the money trail, the security, the quiet agreements that were never meant to be questioned. Because while the public believed this was a goodwill visit, a community-focused tour, the reality unfolding behind the scenes told a different story. One where millions in Australian taxpayer-funded security, armored vehicles, elite units, coordinated operations were being deployed not for a state visit, not for official duty, but for what now appears to be a private, for profit engagement. And when that detail surfaced, when Australians woke up on March 18, realizing their taxes were underwriting a commercial event charging them thousands just to attend, the mood shifted instantly from curiosity to outrage. And that outrage didn't stay contained. It spread, it amplified, it turned into a national question. Why are we paying for this? Why are we funding a spectacle that doesn't serve us? And more. Importantly, who approved it? Who allowed this blurred line between public duty and private profit to exist in the first place? And right there, in that confusion, William reportedly made his move, stepping beyond family silence and into institutional clarity, contacting authorities, drawing a line that had never been drawn so publicly before, making it clear that this was not a state-sanctioned visit, not a royal duty, not something the crown stood behind, effectively stripping away the protective ambiguity that had allowed this entire operation to function. And once that shield dropped, everything underneath became exposed. The structure, the funding, the intent, the strategy, and perhaps the most unsettling element of all, the branding. Because as investigators and journalists began to dig, what they found wasn't just expensive tickets and questionable funding, but a pattern, a deliberate echo of something familiar, fonts, colors, visual cues that mirrored the work associated with Catherine, the Princess of Wales, creating just enough confusion, just enough suggestion to make attendees believe they were supporting something connected to her, especially at a time when public sympathy for her was at its peak. And that detail, that subtle but powerful overlap, is reportedly what pushed William beyond anger into something far more personal. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about optics. It was about using someone else's reputation, someone else's struggle as leverage, as bait, as a silent endorsement that never existed. And to William, that crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. Because while Catherine remained out of the spotlight, maintaining dignity, silence, restraint, her name was allegedly being used to fill seats, to justify prices, to anchor credibility, and that, more than anything, reframed the entire situation from a questionable tour into something far more calculated, far more intentional, a layered strategy where every detail, from ticket tiers to security classification to visual branding, fit together like pieces of a puzzle that only became clear once someone stepped back and looked at the whole picture. And now that picture is impossible to ignore, because as authorities begin to scrutinize the event status, as discussions of fines, audits, and legal consequences consequences start to surface as public pressure builds and hashtags demanding accountability dominate the conversation. One question lingers louder than all the others. Was this ever about helping people? Or was it always about something else entirely? Something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the right person would finally decide to expose it. And just when it seemed like the scandal couldn't deepen any further, when the outrage had already reached a boiling point across Sydney and Melbourne, something even more revealing began to surface. Not from critics, not from the public, but from within the Sussex camp itself. Because by midday on March 18, as pressure mounted and the narrative began slipping out of control, a new explanation quietly emerged. A carefully crafted defense that tried to redirect the blame, suggesting that Harry and Meghan were not the architects of this high-priced operation, but merely victims of internal mismanagement, of overzealous staff, of rogue consultants who allegedly designed the pricing structure, the branding, the entire framework without their full awareness, and on the surface it sounded plausible, even convenient. But the problem with that story is that it doesn't survive scrutiny, because the timeline doesn't match, the scale doesn't match, the coordination required for a global promotional campaign doesn't happen overnight. And more importantly, it doesn't happen without approval, without oversight, without deliberate sign-off at multiple levels. And that's exactly where William reportedly zeroed in again, dismantling this defense piece by piece. Because when you look closely, when you follow the digital trail, when you examine the rollout that began weeks earlier, the posters, the ads, the ticket portals, all aligned under a single consistent strategy, it becomes increasingly difficult to believe that such a machine was operating independently. And that contradiction, the gap between the official explanation and the observable reality, is what has fueled even more suspicion. Because now the question isn't just what happened, it's who knew, who approved, and who benefited. And as investigators begin tracing the financial pathways, what they're reportedly finding only adds to the tension, because the revenue streams, instead of being clearly tied to a registered local charitable structure, appear to be connected elsewhere, raising uncomfortable questions about where the money was actually intended to go, and whether the word charity was being used as a label rather than a function, a shield rather than a mission, and if that's the case, if the structure was, and indeed designed this way from the beginning, then the entire narrative of accidental oversight collapses instantly, replaced by something far more deliberate, far more calculated, something that looks less like a mistake and more like a system. And that realization is exactly what has pushed public sentiment from frustration into full-scale revolt, because by the evening of March 18, this was no longer just a controversy, it had become a national issue, a question of accountability, of trust, of whether public resources had been misused under the cover of goodwill, and the response was immediate. Protests forming outside venues, voices rising, signs demanding refunds, demanding answers, demanding consequences, and as that pressure intensified, the institutional response began to shift as well. Because once William formally clarified that this was not a state visit, once the royal connection was officially severed in practical terms, the protections that had quietly supported the tour began to weaken, the diplomatic cover started to fade, and suddenly the entire operation found itself exposed not just to public criticism, but to regulatory scrutiny, to legal frameworks that operate very differently when something is classified as private business rather than public service. And that distinction, that single shift in classification, may ultimately prove to be the most consequential moment in this entire saga, because it changes everything. The expectations, the responsibilities, the liabilities, and as discussions around fines, potential violations, and even reimbursement of the multi-million-dollar security costs begin to circulate, the situation starts to look less like a PR crisis and more like a legal one, a structured investigation into whether the rules governing charitable events, public funding, and commercial activities have been crossed, intentionally or otherwise. And while that process unfolds, another layer of the story continues to quietly gain attention: the question of motive. Because beneath the outrage, beneath the accusations, there's a deeper narrative forming, one that suggests this wasn't just about a single event in Australia, but part of a broader pattern, a financial reality that may be driving decisions behind the scenes. Because maintaining a global lifestyle at the level the Sussexes have built comes with significant costs, ongoing expenses that require consistent revenue streams, and if those streams begin to narrow, if previous deals slow down or shift, then the pressure to create new ones increases, and suddenly a high-priced overpriced speaking tour framed as a charitable initiative starts to look less like a contradiction and more like a strategy, a way to bridge the gap between image and income, between public persona and private necessity. And that perspective, whether accurate or not, is what has begun to reshape how this entire situation is being interpreted, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger transformation, a shift from traditional royal roles into something more commercial, more transactional, where access becomes a product and narrative becomes currency. And it's precisely that shift that William is reportedly pushing back against with increasing intensity, because from his perspective, the monarchy is built on service, on accessibility, on the idea that its value comes from what it gives, not what it charges. And when that principle is reversed, when the equation flips, it doesn't just create controversy, it creates a fundamental conflict about what the institution represents. And that conflict is now playing out in real time, across countries, across headlines, across public opinion. And as the final scheduled day of the tour approaches, the pressure is no longer just external, it's internal, structural, systemic, because authorities are now actively reconsidering the very basis on which the events were allowed to proceed, the permits, the protections, the classifications. And if those foundations are found to be inconsistent with the reality of the operation, then the consequences could extend far beyond refunds or fines, potentially affecting future engagements, future permissions, future credibility. And that's the point where this story stops being just about Australia and starts becoming something much larger, something with long-term implications. Because once trust is questioned at this level, once the line between public service and private enterprise becomes blurred in such a visible way, it doesn't easily reset. It lingers. It reshapes perception. It alters expectations. And right now, as the final hours unfold, as decisions are being made behind closed doors, as statements are being prepared and strategies recalibrated, one thing remains unmistakably clear. The mask that once held this narrative together has slipped, and what's been revealed underneath is not something that can be easily covered again. Not quickly, not quietly, and certainly not without consequences that are still, even now, continuing to unfold.